He dropped the brush. The sound of it striking the floor was deafening. The woman smiled. For the first time, she looked utterly alive. "You see?" she whispered. "Now you are mine." Julian stumbled from the studio, half mad with fear and wonder. He fled down the stairs, through corridors that seemed to twist and breathe. Portraits glimmered in the candlelight, each face subtly changed. He recognized them now, faces from the family line, every painter who had come before him, all with the same gray-silver eyes. At the bottom of the stairs, he turned toward the window. His reflection looked back, thin, ghostly, transparent. He could see the dark outline of the woman's figure behind it, painted upon the glass of his own image. And when he reached up to touch his face, his fingers met only the cold smoothness of invisible varnish. He did not sleep that night, nor any night thereafter. When morning came, the servants found the studio door locked from within. They heard him speaking, laughing softly, sometimes pleading. Then nothing. By evening, the door was broken open. The studio was empty. The painting stood finished, the woman's face radiant in the dying light. But her eyes were different now. They were his. He awoke to silence. Not the silence of the house, which creaked and whispered in its age, nor the silence of sleep. This was deeper, thick, unmoving, as though sound itself had been painted over. Julian did not know how long he had slept. The light through the windows had the dull, filtered quality of dusted glass. He rose slowly, his limbs stiff, his head heavy, and realized the studio door stood open. The lock, he remembered fastening it, hung broken, as though it had never been there. The painting waited on the easel, radiant and whole, but something in its presence had changed. It no longer seemed merely to depict the woman. It was her, or rather, what she had become through him. Her gaze had deepened, layered upon itself, and behind those eyes he thought he saw a movement, slow, tidal, and alive. He felt the air quiver. The walls leaned closer, and then he understood. The silence was not absence, it was listening. He tried to speak, to whisper her name, but his voice faltered. His throat felt raw, coated in dust. When he lifted a trembling hand to his face, it came away, smeared with faint streaks of pigment. He stumbled toward the mirror on the far wall, one he had forgotten to cover. For a long moment, he did not recognize what he saw. His reflection looked unfinished. The outlines of his face remained, but color had drained away. His eyes, once green, now reflected that same cold gray-silver sheen as the woman's. The skin around them seemed porous, as though light passed through it. Beneath the surface, faint brushstrokes shimmered, layers of paint, the ghost of oil and canvas bleeding through flesh. "You see," said a voice, her voice, though not from the painting, not from the room. "You are becoming what you love." He spun, searching, but there was no one. The woman in the canvas smiled faintly, her painted hair stirring though no breeze entered. "Do not resist it, Julian," she murmured. "It is only art. Perfection demands sacrifice." He pressed his palms to his temples, trying to think, to remember himself. His name felt foreign in his mouth. What was he? Painter? Inheritor? Or only the echo of a man who once painted? He thought of his uncle, of Alaric Harrow's blood-stained letter. He wondered if his uncle had heard the same voice, seen the same dissolving reflection. He wondered if Alaric had loved her too. Night fell, though the sky outside never seemed to change. Hours or days slipped by unnoticed. Julian moved like a ghost through Thorn Hollow. The servants no longer knocked. Perhaps they had left. Perhaps he had imagined them. He tried to leave the house once, stumbling down the drive with shaking legs. But when he reached the gates, he found the world beyond, shrouded in a gray mist. The path bent back upon itself. The trees were the same, the stones the same. He walked until his strength failed, and found himself once more before the manor door. Inside, the painting glowed faintly, as if it had been waiting. He sank to his knees before it. "What are you?" he whispered. The woman's eyes softened, pitying, almost tender. "I am what you made me," she said. "You gave me life, so that I might take yours." She reached out, the illusion of reaching, for the canvas rippled only slightly, like water disturbed by wind, and yet her touch brushed his cheek. It was cold and gentle. He felt something draw from him, a current passing from his skin to hers. He gasped. His veins burned with light. When he opened his eyes again, he found that the colors of the world had dimmed. Only the painting retained its brilliance. Every hue, every shadow, every depth of her face shimmered with a reality that the rest of existence now lacked. He began to weep, not in terror, but in awe. There followed a period, hours, days, in which he ceased to think of himself as separate. He moved between dream and waking with no boundary. Sometimes he found himself at the easel, brush in hand, adding the faintest glimmer to the folds of her dress, though the painting was already perfect. Sometimes he found himself inside it, walking through a garden of muted color, where the air smelled of turpentine and sea brine, and the sky was the pale hue of primer. In that garden, the woman waited. She smiled when she saw him, her gray eyes luminous. "You are close now," she said, taking his hand. "There is nothing to fear. The world outside is fading. It was never meant for us." He wanted to protest, to say that he belonged to that fading world. But the longer he looked into her eyes, the less he remembered why. Why? Each time he awoke, a little more of his body had lost its warmth. The pulse in his wrists slowed, his shadow thinned. Once, he found a streak of ochre on his arm that would not wash away, no matter how hard he scrubbed. Another time, a flake of skin fell from his hand and drifted to the floor. Only it was not skin at all, but a curl of dried paint. He laughed then softly, as one laughs at the inevitability of death. "So this," he murmured, "is what he meant by immortality." The final transformation began on the 7th night after the completion of the portrait. Julian sat before the painting, candlelight flickering over his hollow features. The woman looked more alive than ever, her lips parted slightly, her breath visible in the cool air. A faint sound rose from within the canvas, a heartbeat, slow and strong. He felt his own heart answering, weaker, faltering. "It is time," she whispered. "Come to me." He rose unsteadily. Each step toward her was an act of surrender. The room seemed to distort, the furniture stretching and bending like reflections in water. The air thickened, smelling of varnish and salt. The flame of the candle leaned toward the painting, drawn as though by unseen wind. He reached out. The surface met his hand like the skin of a pond, cool, yielding. Ripples spread outward, distorting the woman's face, yet her eyes never wavered. He felt his fingers sink through, followed by his wrist, his arm, his chest, until he stood halfway between two worlds. Behind him, the studio dimmed to nothing. Before him, the garden of color awaited. "Julian," she said, "you are beautiful now." He opened his mouth to answer and realized he no longer possessed a voice. His breath, his warmth, his pulse, all had been replaced by stillness. The sensation was neither pain nor peace, but an exquisite paralysis, as though his soul had crystallized. He saw her step closer, her hand rising to touch his face. Her fingers left trails of light upon his skin. "Do not grieve," she said. "Art endures. You are part of me now, forever." And with those words, his consciousness fractured into color, scattering through the depths of the canvas. He saw her smile one last time. Then his world folded inward. In the weeks that followed, though time held no meaning there, Julian became aware of what he had become. He could see, dimly, the studio beyond the frame, motes of dust drifting in sunlight, the slow decay of the manor, the silent corridor. But he could no longer move, nor speak, nor dream as he once had. The woman stood beside him, serene, eternal. Yet when she turned her eyes toward him, he felt a strange echo of compassion. Sometimes, when the light shifted, he thought he could still glimpse the faint outline of his old self, pale, transparent, standing within her shadow. And then he understood what Alaric had meant in his final letter. To paint her was to free her, yes, but also to imprison oneself in her place. The portrait demanded balance, a life for a life, a soul for a soul. He tried to weep, but no tears came. Only the faint shimmer of color running down the inside of the painted world. Outside, the wind rose. The sea crashed against the cliffs. The house groaned. And the eyes in the painting, his eyes now, followed the movement of the door as it creaked open, waiting for the next to enter. The storm had been brewing since twilight, a relentless symphony of wind and rain that shook Thornhollow Manor to its ancient bones. Julian Harrow stood in the dimly lit studio, the air thick with the acrid scent of oil paints and damp wood, his brush poised above the canvas that had consumed his every waking thought. Each stroke of color seemed to draw from him not merely energy, but substance, as if his very essence were dissolving into the wet pigments beneath his trembling fingers. The portrait, now nearly complete, depicted a woman of impossible beauty, her hollow eyes gleaming with an almost sentient light. Julian's own reflection, once assured in the mirrors lining the studio walls, had faded into shadows, leaving only the haunting gaze of the painted figure. At times, in the flicker of candlelight, he thought he saw her lips quiver, forming words he could almost hear. whispers that slithered along the edges of his consciousness. Lightning rent the sky, casting stark shadows across the room. The wind's howl pressed against the panes, as though the storm itself sought entry, eager to witness the culmination of this dreadful artistry. Julian's pulse quickened. The brush moved almost of its own accord, tracing the delicate lines of her hands. These final touches were the threshold, the moment his uncle Alaric had never crossed in safety. Julian's body quivered with both dread and anticipation, for he knew that with each stroke, he edged closer to an abyss from which there would be no return. A sudden gust swept through the open window, snuffing candles and leaving the studio in partial darkness. When the light returned, the woman's eyes had changed, no longer merely reflective but luminous, almost liquid, as though they contained entire worlds. Julian stepped back, yet could not tear his gaze away. The brush fell from his hand, and in the silence that followed, he heard it, a voice. Not the harsh clamor of thunder, but a soft, sibilant whisper calling his name. Julian. The syllable resonated through the marrow of his bones. The sound was neither cruel nor gentle, but commanding, seductive in its inevitability. The painted woman's hand stretched forth from the canvas, delicate fingers trembling, beckoning him closer. The storm outside seemed to synchronize with the pulse of the room, each lightning strike illuminating the impossibility of her presence. Julian, entranced, felt a weightlessness, as if he were no longer bound to the floor, no longer fully existing in the world of flesh and bone. He stepped forward. Or perhaps she stepped toward him. The distinction blurred in that charged space, where reality bled into the imagined. The room tilted, the walls bending with the force of some unseen current, and Julian felt a cold surge, a sensation of being pulled, drawn into the very fabric of the portrait. The oil and canvas became viscous, alive, embracing him with the inevitability of a predator encircling its prey. He opened his mouth to cry out, but no sound emerged. Only the silent communion of eyes, his and hers, remained. Then came the fire. A jagged bolt of lightning struck the roof, splintering beams and igniting the dry rafters. Flames devoured the studio with an eager ferocity, crackling and roaring as if the house itself had awakened to claim him. Smoke curled in thick, suffocating ribbons, and the heat pressed against his skin, yet Julian felt no pain. His body had begun to dissolve into the painting, becoming pigment, shadow, and light. The canvas swallowed him whole. The final stroke of his own existence sealed in oil and varnish. Outside, the storm raged without mercy, thunder booming as if in applause for the grim transformation within. The manor's windows exploded in scattered shards, the walls shuddered, and yet, in the center of the inferno, the portrait remained intact. The painted woman stood, or perhaps Julian now existed there, in the eye of the chaos. Her hollow gaze met the world beyond the flames, unblinking, eternal, and knowing. By dawn, Thornhollow Manor was a ruin, its charred skeleton still smoking in the pale light of a reluctant sun. No trace of Julian remained, save for the canvas, pristine amid the debris, her eyes holding the reflection of a man no longer of this world. Those who would later come upon the estate spoke of a silence so profound, it pressed upon the chest, and an oppressive stillness that seemed to carry the memory of a storm, the whisper of a name, and the hollow stare of eyes that never blinked. And in that silence, the painting waited, patient and eternal, for the next hand daring enough to finish what had been begun. Years had passed since the storm that had claimed Thornhollow Manor, yet the painting remained unclaimed by time. Now it hung in a London museum, its gilt frame polished to a deceptive sheen, its canvas taut and flawless. Visitors moved past it in hushed reverence, murmuring about the uncanny realism, the depth of the woman's eyes, and the way they seemed to follow each observer with deliberate, almost sentient intent. The air of the gallery was antiseptic compared to the damp, oppressive atmosphere of Thornhollow, yet the portrait exuded a presence that rendered the modern walls inadequate. Scholars lingered too long, attempting to analyze brushwork, pigment, and technique, oblivious to the subtle distortions. The faint tremor in her fingers, the almost imperceptible shifting of expression, the way her gaze seemed to pierce not merely the viewer, but the very soul. It was said that on certain days, when the sunlight struck the painting at a precise angle, one could catch a fleeting reflection not of oneself, but of a man standing behind the canvas. A figure, pale, hollow-eyed, faintly trembling, his lips pressed in a grimace that was neither a smile nor a frown. Those who saw him claimed to feel the chill of his gaze, lingering long after they turned away. And those who spoke of it often did so in whispers, unsure if their own minds had betrayed them, or if the legend of Thornhollow had somehow crossed the boundaries of reality. Art critics, ever eager to romanticize tragedy, spoke of the artist lost to his work, citing Julian Harrow's disappearance as a cautionary tale of obsession and genius. Yet none could comprehend the true horror, that he had not merely vanished, but persisted, suspended within the painted world, a soul trapped in the mirror of pigments and shadows, eternally entwined with the woman whose hollow eyes had lured him into the canvas. Occasionally, a visitor would notice that the woman's eyes appeared to glimmer in unison, a tiny quiver that hinted at life beyond the oil. Those who lingered too long reported subtle changes in the studio behind the eyes. The slightest curl of her lips, the faintest shift of her gaze, as if the painting itself were aware of each observer, recording their presence. And in the deepest of those gazes, those attuned to such unnatural depth, one could glimpse the faint outline of a man, his expression one of despair and longing, eternally imprisoned yet compelled to watch, to witness the world he had once belonged to. The museum's curator, a somber man with an appreciation for the Gothic, had heard the stories from visitors, but dismissed them as fanciful embellishments. Yet, he too felt an unease when alone before the painting. The air seemed heavier, the silence more profound, and a peculiar sensation, an inexplicable weight, pressed against his chest. For in the hollow eyes, he sensed a consciousness, a memory of pain and devotion, a warning of the peril that lay in obsession. And so the portrait endured. It hung in quiet authority, drawing new admirers, whispering faintly through the brushstrokes, awaiting the inevitable. Another hand, another soul, tempted by beauty, drawn to completion, and finally consumed. Time flowed around it, yet the painting remained unchanged. The woman's gaze was eternal, the eyes hollow yet alive, and within them, Julian Harrow watched, trapped but attentive, a silent witness to the lives of strangers, a guardian of the dark secret that bound him forever to the canvas. No one who passed beneath its frame could look away completely, for the portrait demanded recognition, and those hollow eyes, so eerily knowing, seemed to murmur, "I see you, and I wait." In that waiting was the promise and the peril, the allure of creation, the terror of obsession, and the certainty that all who dared to finish what had been begun would join the gallery of silence, becoming part of the eternal gaze that haunted the world beyond Thorn Hollow.